Hey guys, so this is going to be my presentation about Scrabble without word knowledge. I gave this talk at a tournament. I had some technical difficulties, so those of you who were at that tournament may want to watch, and for those that you haven't, please enjoy. So first, a little bit about me. I graduated from Hampshire College with a major in game theory. Game theory is an economic concept. It's not really something about Scrabble and Othello and all that stuff. That being said, you do learn a lot about those games. My thesis was actually in economic irrationality. I've also been rated in the top 5 for most of the last 4 years, and probably even a little bit before that. I've been playing for about 10 or 15 years. Probably been a good player for about 10 years or so. And I'm also involved talking strategy with many of the best players in the world. There's sort of this myth that none of the top players talk. We talk all the time, especially the younger players. A lot of the older players have a lot of really unique ideas, but in terms of the younger players, we all pretty much have the same basic approach. We may disagree about certain particulars, and we may not have exactly the same style, but we pretty much play in a way such that we're much more similar to each other than many of the older players. And I think we've updated our style to the new metagame much better than some of the older players. And if you haven't noticed, most of the people who contend in major tournaments nowadays are the younger players. So this is going to be about word knowledge. So first we're going to go through challenge strategy, and then we're going to go through strategic adjustments. Before we start, I want to go through some caveats. Some words still are going to be required. The 2s, the 3s, the high probability bingos, and some of the basic words that you need for Scrabble. At the end of the day, Scrabble is a word game, so you're going to need to know like JQXE words, you're going to need to find some bingos, you're going to need to score points. You can only do so much with limited word knowledge. You don't need to have a huge vocabulary, but you need to have a basic Scrabble vocabulary. You also need a very dedicated approach. You can't be just thinking willy-nilly. You need some practice with this, and you need to be able to think of this game very analytically. You can't just make whatever move floats off the top of your head. A lot of people do have success at doing that. I'm certainly not one of them. I'm a very, very methodical player. And finally, this requires practice thinking about Scrabble beyond a word game. At the end of the day, Scrabble is a board game. It is not a word game. It does have a word element for sure, but it's much better to think strategically like Scrabble is not a word game, but it's a board game. First, we're going to talk about challenge strategy. What to do when your opponent plays words that you don't recognize, and then we're going to talk about strategic adjustments. So, first thing we should look at is why do people play phonies? And it's not obvious. Some of the reasons are obvious, but some of them aren't. First reason is just simple word confusion. They think the word is a word. They think that their play is a word. But that's by far the most common. Some people might think that it has an alternate spelling, or they may think of 2 different words and combine them and make a third word that just isn't a word. It's misspelled by 1 letter for 2 different words. Sometimes they make a phony because they're hoping that their opponent will hook or extend the word. They may think it's a verb, or they may hook an S or a Y or an LY to it. Something like that, so that they can also get the free challenge that way. And sometimes they're just desperate. They're behind by way too many points, and they can't think of any other way to win the game other than playing a phony. That's also another very common reason that people play phonies. First thing you need to do to challenge these sorts of words is you need to understand your opponents. Better word knowledge, first of all, does not mean omniscience. Lots of people have better word knowledge. It doesn't mean they know all the words. They can still get confusion. They can still be trying things. They can still be unsure. No one knows all the words. Even the top players don't know all of the words all of the time. Inferior word knowledge is also not a reason to completely avoid phonies. Just because you're playing somebody with better word knowledge doesn't mean that you should never play a phony. If you're unsure, you think it's likely that something's a word, or even if you just think that you can get away with a phony, you should try it even though you might be playing somebody better, or somebody with better word knowledge. Pay attention to demographics. People who are younger players, people who have been losing a lot lately, people who are just more arrogant than usual, these are people who definitely are much more likely to play phonies. In contrast, people who are conservative, people who are very laid back, people who want Scrabble to be a word game and view this as having a good old time, are much less likely to play phonies. They're much more likely to try to play everything very straightforward. And finally, mental state matters. People who are very insecure or shooken up are not going to play phonies. And people who are very confident or even arrogant, or people who are actually just angry are actually much more likely to play phonies. It really depends on what state of mind that person is at the given time. Is my opponent bluffing? So, phonies can be thought of as a bluff. Sometimes they can be thought of as a partial bluff, given whether they think there's actually a chance that the word is good. But even if there's a partial bluff, it's still really making a move. It's still really hoping that you won't challenge. The best thing to think of when you're thinking about these is not the number of points the phony scores. It's actually about the marginal difference between that play and the next best play, given the tiles that they've used. So, for example, you have the word ovally. You can either try the word ovally, which scores 32 points, or you can play the word alloy, which keeps a V and scores 24 points. Also, drolly is another example. You could play dolly instead. Opponent clearly has dolly, so drolly is very unlikely to be a bluff, but on the other hand, ovally is quite likely to be a bluff because there's a very significant benefit. It's 8 more points and it gets rid of the V. So, ovally is therefore much more likely to be a bluff. And these are the sorts of things you should be looking for. People aren't really likely to bluff if the benefit isn't there. They're likely to be very, very sure that they think it's a word. They might be wrong, but they definitely think that what they're playing is a word. Mistakes are, on the other hand, very different. The marginal benefit can be very, very small. You should pay attention to their behavior, particularly when they say the word hold, or particularly when you think that you're questioning the word, because then you get some sort of visceral response as to whether they think the word is good. Especially once they get to think about it, their response might change. They may get nervous. They may want you to challenge. They may climb up, but you have to look at how they climb up to see if that's really a climbing up or if that's some sort of ploy to try to get you to challenge. It's worth noting, experts are not really experts at this sort of thing. They're not experts at acting or bluffing. We don't practice these things. We don't take long periods of time to practice these things. You're going to be just as good at these things as we are. And there also might be word insecurity. In other words, we think it's probably a word, but we're not sure. When people take a long time or when they play almost immediately, those are very sure signs of word insecurity. And finally, you have to think about how sure you are, given all of these factors, given the fact that they might be bluffing, and just your gut intuition. I'm measuring that against what is the cost of being right and what is the cost of being wrong and what is the benefit of being right. You need to weigh all those things together to come to some sort of conclusion. I think it's really useful to take a look at the math as well. Most people don't actually do math in-game, and I'm not suggesting that you do, but it's really good to have just some sort of general guideline overview of the math, even just to see what type of numbers you need to be looking at in general. Especially when you're unsure of challenging, or you're unsure that they're going to be playing phonies, or unsure of playing a phony yourself. So both players, when they make a phony and when they challenge a phony, they're laying odds. Generally, if you think it's 50-50, you shouldn't challenge, and generally when you think it's 50-50, you probably shouldn't play the word either. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in general, you are laying odds. The most important math is actually the lost turn. It's 35 points on average, is usually an average play, especially at the expert level. If you're at a little bit lower level, it's a little bit lower. It's probably 25 to 30. But that's really the important number. It's not the number of points that your play scores, it's the number of points that the next turn that you have lost would score. So if you make a 9-point play and it's challenged, or you make a 70-point play and it's challenged, it's actually not really all that different. Because you're not, a 70-point play is often going to have a really good option, and a 9-point play probably isn't. You're really not losing that much. You're losing whatever the next rack would be. So the ovally benefits about 14 points over alloy, since it's 8 more points and it keeps the V, which is normally about -6. I won't get into exactly how much it is. It obviously depends, but about -6. So 8 plus 6 is 14. So the benefit of playing ovally over alloy is 14. And therefore you're laying 35, which is the average turn, over 14 plus 35, which is 49, which is 5/7, so roughly 71%. So if your opponent will always challenge correctly, or always make the right decision, then you need to be 71% sure that ovally is a word and able to play it over alloy. The math for challenging is roughly about 50-50. It's based on the same sort of thing. Again, you're laying a little bit. You're probably laying about 60-40. And obviously depends on what options your opponent is blocking or taking from you. So, and of course what options you're creating. If it's giving you a bingo line for your bingo, then it's obviously not very good to challenge unless you're absolutely sure. Likewise, if he's blocking your bingo, it's probably likely that you should be challenging even if you think it's probably 50-50 or so. Really depends on the options. By the way, when I say 50-50, I mean that including your opponent having played the word. So if you're 80% sure it's bad in isolation, but you think your opponent's never playing a phony, it's probably something close to 50-50. In short, the main thing I want you to get from these is challenge when players have no alternatives to playing the phony, or when an intentional phony is possible or likely. Be much more likely to challenge in those scenarios, and think about the marginal benefit. If your opponent has good other options, you should generally let it go. Even if you're wrong, you generally have to be pretty sure, because your opponent's going to be pretty sure that they're right. They're not going to risk playing a phony unless they're pretty sure that it's a word, or unless they're pretty sure they can get it by. And the score of play doesn't really matter. It's the overall benefit that matters. You should always keep that in mind, that people have these general rules of thumb, like if it's over 80 points, you need to challenge. It really doesn't matter, especially in a lot of situations where the best play and the next best play are pretty close, which happens a lot in bingos or happens a lot in high scoring options. So another challenge strategy that happens quite often is hooks. This means that players play phonies to try to get you to hook them sooner or later, or you're really unsure of a hook. So you're really sure of the word that they play, or you're pretty sure of the word that they play, but you're not sure whether it takes an S, for example. For example, does no way take an S? For most people, this isn't an obvious decision. One of the common things that people do is they don't play the hook themselves, but they also don't challenge. This is generally really, really bad, especially if the phony is intentional. Maybe if the phony is accidental, this is an okay strategy, or if they themselves are unsure, but if they have the potential to bluff you, you really shouldn't do this strategy. You're going to get exploited fairly heavily. Much better solution is to either try the word yourself or commit to challenging. So, in theory, when somebody actually plays a phony hook, or plays the S on the no way, it actually is much more likely that it's a word now, because that means that your opponent's willing to try it. They're willing to take the risk. That being said, you still need to commit yourself to challenge, because you're also very, very likely to be getting exploited a large percentage of the time. But you need to make the decision right when no way is played, and right when you accept that word, you need to decide, are you going to hook the S or are you going to challenge? There's really no in-between. Any in-between option is just really, really terrible and leads to really, really bad results. And often 50 to 100 point swings. You're much better actually just playing the word. If you're not sure, if you really just have no clue whatsoever, you're much better just trying it and losing the turn if you're wrong, because it's only a turn. Whereas in other cases, you might lose the turn later. Your opponent might bingo for like 90 and still get the turn. There's all sorts of board considerations you have to take care of. It's much better off just to lose the turn right away. Hooks are really, really effective. They're generally what I try to do when I try to play phonies. I try to leave phony hooks, or I try to make hooks that I think my opponent won't know. If I have better word knowledge, that's what I'm trying to do. And as somebody with word knowledge, that's what you should be trying to avoid. And yeah, only switch courses in really, really extreme scenarios, like it would be game losing, or you're guaranteed to win the game if you accept the phony, or you're guaranteed, you need the phony to be bad. You really shouldn't change your mind very often at all. There's also extensions. Extensions are much like just normal words. There's not really much of a difference. Most people don't know really long words, so if they make a 9-letter extension, they're probably just guessing too. Maybe they're desperate or something, but you should just use the same logic as you use for normal words. So now I'm going to switch courses, and I'm going to go with different strategies that you can use against people with strong word knowledge. The first strategy is board control. So it's actually pretty hard to bingo on Scrabble. The board's only 15 by 15, and that means 240 bingo lines for 7s and 200 lines for 8s, assuming that you can play every single line, assuming that every line on the board is open, which of course it never is. In reality, it's much, much fewer. Usually there's only, a handful of options for 7s and 8s on a given board, for most boards. It's important to remember that Scrabble is a board game, and board games primarily are about space. This means not about words, not about scoring points, it's about space. So when you're trying to control the board, you're trying to control space. When I say space, I mean spaces to play bingos. Primarily, there are 2 ways to limit bingo lines. Restriction, which is limiting the accessibility to part of the board, and exhaustion, which is forcing bingos to be very, very long, or putting multiple tiles in a bingo lane so that you'd have to use both of them to use all of your tiles. So the left is an example of restriction. As you can see, there's not really many lanes available. There's line 14, but it's kind of bad. And the entire top, the entire black space over here is restricted. The right side is an exhausted board, so everything would have to be 9s. The entire bottom of the board, it's impossible to play bingo that's not a 9, or it's not starting with N, which is very, very difficult. And as you can see, the top of the board is available for bingo lines, but you have to go across. You can't even go down. And the bottom is just pretty much hopeless at this point. So board control usually means quadrant control. The goal is to limit access to at least one quadrant, and to significantly reduce space for bingos and other long, obscure boards. Most players, especially not world-class players, really don't know how to combat the strategy very well. It's actually pretty difficult. You need to do some permutation, you need to do some thinking. I do talk about it in my book some. But yeah, there's several ways to do this. The first way is a right angle. So in this case, you have whips and severed. And you can kind of form an arrow. So extending the board to this black area is going to be very, very difficult. Second example is a zipper, which is a parallel play. Usually makes it very, very hard to extend the board in one given direction. So here we have jib and hotel, and it's very easy to extend down. It's actually pretty easy to extend this way too until this hotel's line is blocked. But it's very, very difficult to extend to the top left of the board. It's actually even somewhat difficult in the top right if hotels is hooked and played downward. In general, quadrant control works much better against certain players than others. Definitely always an effective strategy. Mostly works best against people who are trying to force the board open, because they generally don't really know what to do in these cases, so they make 10-point plays that you can make 25 back. It's very, very easy to play when they feel like they need to open a bingo line and have no idea how, because they just make random openings that are easily blocked and provide lots and lots of good scoring opportunities for you. That being said, you should only use this with a lead, or at least with a close game. Otherwise, you're just going to have no bingos. You're going to need a bingo yourself, and you're not going to be able to get one. And of course, watch out for hooks. That's the main way that you actually open one of these sorts of boards. You make hooks that are very difficult to block. That's the primary strategy to counter quadrant control. Also remember, elite players, world-class players, people who have won major tournaments, they're not going to let you do this for free. They're always going to have a plan to make sure this doesn't happen, because they face this strategy a lot. And as a result, they know what to do. They're either going to prevent you from doing this, or they're going to have a plan so that when you do this, they have a way to open the board back up. So the second strategy is going to be entropy creation. First, we're going to define entropy. Entropy is a very, very necessary topic, and I talk about this a bunch in a bunch of different places. But it's really important that everybody understand it. It's a very, very fundamental concept. Entropy is a measure for the propensity of the score to change. There are different types of leads. Sometimes it's 200 to 150, but it's very, very likely the swings are very, very massive. Being up 200 to 150 isn't a big deal on a board with lots of bingo lines and lots of scoring spots, lots of space available to make more bingo lines. But on a closed board, a 200 to 150 lead is massive. So those closed boards have low entropy, and those open boards with lots of scoring and space options, those have high entropy. It's always important to remember swings occur mostly because of bingo lines and not because of scoring spots. It's really, really hard to swing the game based on a J or Q or X play. Obviously, if there's maybe a double, triple opening, there's 2 or 3 bonus lines combined, or you make some sort of setup, something like that, it can swing, but in general, it's going to mostly be because of 7-letter plays, or 7-tile plays. Entropy only matters also after your opponent's turn, and assumes that they can't really block effectively or use the spot that you've created. You might create a spot that's really, really good for your opponent and has really, really large swings, but if they're just going to either use it for 50 or block it, you're really not increasing entropy at all. You need to be creating many options such that even after your opponent tries to do something to either block or use that spot, you still have options available on your turn. That's what's really important. So when you're against word knowledge, somebody who has a lot of word knowledge, you should really make dangerous openings that are pretty difficult to block or pretty difficult to use. Not so difficult that you can't use it yourself, but you do need to keep in mind that your opponent is going to try to block. And this isn't really an anti-word knowledge strategy, it's more of an anti-confidence strategy, because people who feel like they are favored to win the game will go through massive efforts to block the board and minimize risk, even if it means sacrificing some immediate points, wrecking their leave, etc. They want to take away all the variance that they can. They want to reduce entropy. That's often their goal. And as a result, this works very, very well against elite players. If you're playing Nigel Richards or some elite player who's won multiple championships, you really should seek to increase entropy and just make as much variance and as many swings as humanly possible. Entropy is also created a lot by creating either setups or fishing plays. And finally, leave inference is your friend, which we'll go over on a future slide. So here's the first example. You're playing the word null here. And you're setting up your S, and it's very, very difficult to block this S. Both Y's are out, so the Y isn't going to be a very big deal. And it's very difficult even to use this T over. It's just very, very difficult to plot this. If your opponent has the last S, then they're going to be able to use it for a lot of points, but it's a huge swing either way. One of you is going to get to use that spot and probably score quite well in doing so. Here we're going to talk about negative leave inference. Negative leave inference is implying that your opponent does not have a certain tile, given their previous plays. You can also do positive leave inference, which is including that they do have a certain tile, but what's most effective against people with large word knowledge, or against top players in general, is negative leave inference, and using that to create entropy. So a lot of times what happens is that you create a lot of panic, and they don't really know what to do in a lot of these situations. Opponents will often sacrifice a lot of points to block if they can. Even if it's not really necessary that you have what you're setting up at all. There's this notion that you always need to have the X when you're setting up or the S when you're setting it up. As long as you know that your opponent doesn't, it really doesn't matter because chances are that your opponent's going to block anyway and often sacrifice a lot of points to do so. So here's a second example. You have the word muggiest and you can play it in two spots. If you play it one higher up, you're creating an X spot here and you're creating a Z spot here. Just all sorts of options. And your opponent's last play was did, so they can't really have the X, and they can't really have the Z. It's really, really hard for them. They would play something else, maybe dits or something like that. Oxid. So, as a result, they're gonna sacrifice a lot of points to play here. Even if they can score 40 or something here, they might score like 20 or 25 here, just to block all of the options that you created. Because they're afraid of what you may have drawn. And this is an example of creating entropy. And why it's very, very effective. Because not only do you get extra points, you get your opponent to sacrifice a lot of points as well. Here's another example, AEGINRY. So there's lots of options. You can play like AY or play short. You can exchange the Y. You can make a fishing play, which has lots and lots of entropy. Or you can make something that's much lower entropy, something like grainy, for example. And as you can guess, it's much better to fish if you want to create entropy. Even though it's going to create a more open board, so does grainy. Grainy is going to create a pretty open dynamic, and you're much more likely to know the words with AEGINR. If you're not, you're actually probably you're much better off to play grainy, but the main question isn't whether you have good word knowledge or not, it's whether you have good word knowledge with the given play that you're making. So do you know a word like energia or regini, for example? But yeah, it's generally not a very good idea. You actually require more word knowledge to play something like Gade open, because then you're going to draw a lot of high point consonants like a B or an F, and you need to be able to find bingos with those. And if you can't find a bingo with those, you shouldn't be playing them. You shouldn't be playing Gay. You shouldn't put yourself in situations where you need to. You should be playing something like Exchange Y, because at least you're going to find most of those bingos. Like I said, you need some bingo knowledge to start, otherwise you're just not going to be a very successful Scrabble player. So in conclusion, lean towards the words you know and trust your intuition. Those are obvious. But I hope that this helps you. So yeah, those are my tips for strategy for people who have limited word knowledge. In conclusion, it's always worth trusting your first instinct, especially with something towards word knowledge. A lot of word knowledge becomes somewhat unconscious and is not immediately obvious to everybody. But by following these tips, you should be able to manage playing against people with better word knowledge, at least a little bit better, or at least a little bit more successfully. It's always important to be confident, or to be very understanding of what you are, and not to let the difference in word knowledge affect you. I think that difference and that confidence difference is actually a much bigger deal than the actual difference in words itself. Most top players, if you look at their boards, they only have usually 1 or 2 words that are actually obscure. Most of them are fairly common words, and word knowledge really isn't as big of a deal as people make it out to be. But by making these adjustments, hopefully it will help you do even better against the people who have better word knowledge than you do.